Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion in recognition of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Today's webinar focuses on some of the more recent events affecting the Asian American community. Our topic tonight is Together versus Hate, addressing the rise in racism against Asian Americans. Tonight's panel is hosted by the Evansville-Vanderburgh County Human Relations Commission. Individuals that believe they have been discriminated against based on race or other protected class can file a complaint with our office. We are located in room 209 of the Civic Center complex, and you can also reach us by calling 812-436-4927 or email us at hrc@evansville.in.gov. My name is Anna Ardeline, and I'm a political science major at the University of Southern Indiana. I've spent the spring semester interning with the Human Relations Commission, and it is in this capacity that I am thrilled to help moderate tonight's discussion.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Xavier Harrington. I'm currently an assistant professor of education at the University of Southern Indiana, located here in Evansville, Indiana, and I serve as a commissioner on the Human Relations Commission here in Evansville, Indiana. It is my pleasure to serve as your co-moderator alongside the lovely Anna Ardeline, USI's newest SGA president. We are so excited to have you here for what we hope to be an informative but eye-opening night for you to learn a little bit more about what's happening in the world, how we can help our Asian American and Pacific Islanders brothers and sisters, and how we can hope to decrease any instances of hate crime and whether we see any of those hate crimes happening here in our beloved city. Joining us tonight is an impressive group of individuals. We do have a variety of different ideas and expertise and educations, and we will introduce the panel in just a minute. However, we're going to start off tonight's discussion with a short video that helps to explain the history and the context behind some of the topics that we hope to cover with you all tonight. Please submit any questions you may have in the chat. There will also be a moderator heading to Facebook to check for any questions or comments that we would like to pose to the panelists in just a second. However, remember, all questions can come from either Facebook chat or sort of just messaging our moderators privately here. We are going to play said video for you, and then we will jump back in momentarily. Anna?
Since last March, there were nearly 3,800 reported incidents of hate toward Asian American and Pacific Islanders.
I think we got a lot more reports than the government would.
The incidents range from verbal harassment to physical assault.
They said, our respondents, that they didn't want necessarily individual redress. They wanted a voice to say, this is happening, and we want policies to stop it.
The deadliest attack happened on March 16th.
Some tragic news, the deadly shootings in Atlanta.
21-year-old Robert Long charged with killing 8 people in 3 separate massage parlors last night.
6 out of the 8 people killed on Tuesday night were of Asian descent.
President Trump clearly stoked the flames of xenophobia against AAPIs with his rhetoric.
Since the outbreak of the coronavirus last year, President Trump tried to shift blame from his own management of the pandemic to China.
I think we have 19 or 20 versions of the name. Chinese flu, Wuhan virus, Kung flu.
When President Trump insisted on using the term Chinese virus, it racialized the virus. It wasn't just biological, it was Chinese. And he stigmatized Chinese people as the carriers of the disease.
I am proud to be Asian. I belong here. I belong here.
This, unfortunately, is not the first time China or Chinese Americans are being blamed for a disease, and racism and violence against Asians has always come in waves throughout U.S. history.
So you can see that in the plague outbreak in San Francisco in 1900. Because the first person in San Francisco to die of plague was a Chinese American, they were sort of blamed and scapegoated for the outbreak, even though the outbreak likely came from Hawaii aboard an American-Australian ship. There were other plague outbreaks, and later on in 1907 and 1908, because they weren't in the Chinese community, they were squashed much more quickly and taken more seriously by authorities.
Even outside of a virus outbreak, The U.S. is no stranger to anti-Asian racism. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration for 10 years.
Even after that, there were very strict guidelines for allowing Chinese people into the United States that weren't repealed until 1943.
But around the same time, soon after Pearl Harbor, FDR signed an executive order that forced 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. This policy lasted 4 years. In 1982, in Highland Park, Michigan, 2 white men targeted and beat to death 29-year-old Chinese American Vincent Chin because he was Asian. The judge gave the men probation and a $3,000 fine. Anti-Asian racism has been an invisible stain in American history. It is often overlooked or minimized.
The Asian American community is left out of public conversation around racial justice. And that's what's unique about this moment that I think you're seeing, unfortunately, because of these gruesome attacks, a movement sort of building among Asian Americans.
But what I see Asian Americans do, and which is actually encouraging in this dark moment, is that you can go into flock mode, right? You could go to a flight or fight mode, or you could flock. And that's when you gather together to protect each other, when you gather together and stand up to whatever threats you're experiencing. And I see that.
Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month is truly an opportunity to not only celebrate, Asian culture, but also focus on the issues that face our AAPI brothers and sisters. The video that you just watched provided some of the history on the discrimination that Asian Americans face within the United States. It also reminds us of where we are today and amid the COVID-19 pandemic, why we're here today. So now please allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists for today's event. I'm going to start with Jinvin Tsai, president of the Tri-State Chinese Culture Association, Dr. Sujin Zhang, professor of the public health at the University of Evansville. We do think you're the president of the United States, Sujin. Dr. Stephanie Young, assistant professor of communication studies at the University of Southern Indiana, and Dr. Chad Schroeder, professor of criminal justice at the University of Southern Indiana. And last but not least, Akane Suzuki, international student at the University of Evansville. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anna.
So this has been a historic time for Asian Americans stemming from political rhetoric as a result of the pandemic. Just to start us off tonight, could you each please give an opening statement with your general thoughts and/or experiences on this phenomenon?
I guess I can start it. Okay, according to what I read or what I heard, this is this latest incident, in the Atlanta shooting. It's not an isolated incident. It's just a string of racism and hatred toward Asian people. Back in 18th century and 19th century and 20th century, now we are in 21st century, and we're still seeing the same discrimination against us. And I just wondering what went wrong in our education system. I mean, do our kids, K-12 school kids, ever learn anything about Asian culture or the Asian people contribution to this country? And just mind-boggling that something that continue and 200 years later, and we're still seeing it. So.
Great perspective and great insight. It does make us question what we're teaching our children, right? That these values then go into 2020 and 2021 with us, and they've never left. Anyone else? Any perspective on sort of your general thoughts?
I want to first thank you all so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation that we're having to directly address discrimination, hate, racism, and violence against Asian Americans. I agree that while you asked the question of, it's a historic time. I think it's a historic time right now for activism and directly addressing racism against multiple groups, right? With Black Americans, with Latino Americans, with Asian Americans. I think that we're seeing these conversations across the board about racism in all its forms. And so at the same time, this is not new. And that's what's unfortunate, right? That this is just another cycle, right? Another recognition, and only, as the video stated, only when violence, right, ensues is there sort of all of a sudden a visibility and media attention given, when in fact this is not a new phenomenon, but rather something that's is now being addressed because of the violence that's ensuing.
I guess I'll chime in. Yeah, I definitely see, like everyone else is saying, that historically you can see this occurring over and over again. I mean, you have in the 1880s, you have the massacre of Chinese in Wyoming. You have all of the Chinese in Tacoma kicked out. I mean, basically, and then they torched the city and looted all of the city as well. And I mean, this happens over and over again. And then you have just 2 decades later, the same thing with, in San Francisco in terms of this. And like you're saying, it's cross race, it's cross religions. So you also see Jews, anti-Semitic attacks against Jews because they're said to be behind, that they invented this for a profit, right? So that they could sell the vaccines. And so it becomes part of these like old secret cabal society stuff. The weird conspiracies all start to lap over. And so that's kind of how I'm seeing it now. Like old times, but overlaps living things.
I think that's a great point, Dr. Schroeder, and that the rhetoric hasn't really changed, right? We use this rhetoric, this hateful rhetoric on different groups of people when it suits the narrative. Thank you for adding that. Anyone else, your overall experience or thoughts here before we move on?
So in terms of, we mentioned the Atlanta shooting, and I wanted to sort of go back to that and touch on that a bit. You see that there in public health, we talk about different kinds of determinants and issues that result in negative outcomes. And so for me, for the Atlanta shooting, there's a lot of things intersecting there. So there's the issue of gun violence in general in the US, along with gun access. And then there's the issue with xenophobia and racism and hatred and all of that rolled into it. And then intersecting that with misogyny. So there's a lot of things that are coming together, and it's just this kind of terrible storm that ended up with all these folks being murdered. And so we have to think about, we think about anti-Asian hate, we think about racism, but we also think about the other things that are going on in our society that fuels that, along with those sentiments that are always underlying in society. In general, whenever there are times of turmoil in history, it seems that those who are sort of others in the American society's viewpoint are the ones that tend to get blamed. And some of that is out of frustration of things that people cannot control. Things happen in life and people can't control it. They want to focus that anger, they want to focus that frustration on something. And oftentimes it lands in the laps of those who are not considered, the majority white population. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that.
Thank you for adding that. Anyone else?
This is just from my experiences living here. I've been here for quite a long time, and I've been told racial comments, stereotypical comments, slurs, and it's really sad, but I'm just kind of used to it at this point. I've been living here for more than 10 years, but when I see on the news about how Asian people are being like assaulted or killed, it does kind of make me scared. Like my family or my friends, my Asian friends can be the next victims of that, like, because it's been happening for so long, happening so often, it's on the news all the time. Like, even though, Evansville, Newberg are pretty small cities, and it's kind of hard to imagine that, but there's still a possibility of being a victim just because I'm Asian.
I think it kind of brought up a really good point. Living with those kinds of microaggressions that you experience throughout your life, there are a lot of things that make you kind of question what's going on. If something that is happening, is it driven by race? Is it driven by racism? And then you become kind of hyper aware of your situation. So I can give you an example personally that happened to me. I was taking a walk with my mother and my two girls in my neighborhood. There were three boys that were probably older elementary, maybe junior high-ish, playing, and there's a pond, so they are fishing. I walked by, and as soon as I pass them, I hear this loud thud behind me, and I turn around, and there's this huge log on the walk path. And and I look over, and one of the other boys said, "Did you throw that?" to this other kid in their party. And so, you know, it makes me, because of the kinds of things that are happening recently, it makes me wonder, because I live in a part of Evansville, there's not that many Asians at all. Not that Evansville has a lot of Asians to begin with, but I live in an area that is predominantly very white. So it made me question, you know, was he kind of throwing that at us, kind of a way to sort of, I don't know. I mean, he was young. And so I know a lot of times little kids do things that, you know, they're not trying to be hurtful or hateful, but you also kind of wonder, like, what's driving children to act that way. And so, of course, he looked at me, and our eyes met, and I said, "Hey, you know, if you throw things like that, it's going to hurt people." But he had this very guilty look on his face, like he did it on purpose. And so, you know, that worries me, because I'm an adult and they're kids, so I can sort of have some control over that situation. But I had two girls with me. What are they gonna do, right? They're young kids. So how are my children gonna deal with this? I mean, my girls are already getting a little bit of microaggression. The fact that my last name, because phonetically it's a little different to try to pronounce, people trip over it, and that makes her absolutely self-conscious. And she brings that stress home, because she says she didn't want to write her last name anymore. She was upset about it. And so, and she was genuinely upset about it. Like, she cried at one point when I told her, I asked her, "Why didn't you want to write your last name?" And she said that was why. Or, you know, there's a couple of other Asian girls in her class, and they're Japanese. And all the kids always ask them, "Are y'all sisters? You know, are y'all related?" And so they're young. They don't really know what they're asking. But it also tells you that there's not discussions, obviously, at their homes, in their communities where they frequent, about diversity. And the fact that all folks who look similarly like we do, we're not all Japanese, we're not all, you know, Chinese, we're not all this and that, we're not a monolith. And people who we look like this, because, you know, I mean, we're not all related to each other. So yeah, definitely. I think you brought up a really good point about your experience of growing up in the US as an Asian.
And talking about those microaggressions, that leads right into my next question. To my knowledge, Evansville has had no reported hate crimes against Asian Americans. Do you think that that's reflective of the reality in our city? Or do you think that there's some other reason why nothing's being reported?
Well, the last time I checked it, Asian population in Evansville area, it's only like 1%, not even 1%, it's like 0.98%. And state of Indiana as a whole is only like 1.2%. So, you know, it's that might be the reason why, you know, that, yeah, you don't hardly see any Asian out in the store, you know, like Walmart or, you know, Eastland Mall. So, yeah, the rarity of Asian people that, you know, will be, you know, have less chance of running into a confrontational, you know, people, like crazy people. So, but you see those, you know, you see the incident like in the East Coast, New York City, San Francisco on the West Coast, and Oakland on the West Coast, and Los Angeles. You know, you see all of them because they are Asian people concentrated area in the U.S. So you have more contact made, and a lot of contact may not be the one you want.
That's a good point. There's just less opportunity for it to happen
Right.
in this area.
And you also have to realize that Indiana really had no hate crime laws until a couple years ago, and it's still pretty weak. So they wouldn't be keeping records on that because it doesn't exist in this state, So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about there not being those kind of crimes occurring.
And I think what we need to also recognize is that just because there's no reported cases associated with hate crimes doesn't mean there isn't racism and discrimination and those everyday microaggressions, right?
Right.
Just because we don't have a violent attack that has occurred doesn't mean that there aren't verbal attacks in an everyday experience being Asian American in Evansville, that we still face, those things. An example that I can give is that I had a friend of mine who was a young Korean American woman. She had recently immigrated, had a racist incident that occurred at an auto parts store in Evansville. And this was just when sort of the pandemic was, I think it was in April of last year. And so they were limiting the number of customers. And she had walked into the store way before these other individuals. Another couple came in, and the manager approached her specifically and said, "You have to leave the store. That's the rule. There's too many people." And she was like, "I was here before them, paying a customer." And the manager actually started yelling at her, breaking the rule. Like, he was yelling at her, and she's trying to understand. And he muttered something like, "She doesn't understand." So he thinks that she doesn't understand because her English isn't perfect, but she knows exactly what's going on. And when she left, other customers were walking in, and they're basically asking her questions. And she was just, again, sort of trying to process this and trying to explain. And the manager walked outside and started yelling at her and said he was going to call the cops on her. So what does she do, right? She's new to the area. She has no idea. She comes to me, and I say, like, we need to go to corporate, right? But basically, we're going to call folks to make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, this isn't a hate crime per se, but that stuff happens here in Evansville, right? And it's also thinking about, like, if we do have folks reporting things, where do they go, right? Where is that information? How do we go about addressing this? And we didn't know, right? Like, how do you do that? I think that's also important to consider. That, again, we do face these things, and just because we don't have reported hate crimes doesn't mean there isn't hate going on.
Absolutely, that's horrible. But yeah, I think hate crime is such a strong word, and people think that it needs to meet a certain bar to report it, to bring it forward or anything either.
Does the state of Indiana have the hate crime that Dr. Schroeder say yes?
Yeah, they passed one in 2019, I believe.
Okay.
It was really watered down, and it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I don't think it listed the category. I'm sorry, I just remember it being pretty weak at the time. But
So,
we were one of the last states to add a hate crimes law. So.
Okay.
Todd, I also wonder if those laws also put the onus on the victims, right, to prove that it's a hate crime. I don't know, but I'm saying, like, how do you go about proving things in terms of hate crime?
And that's kind of a problem too, is because you have to have law enforcement that's trained to recognize these things as hate crimes, which is important. Then you also have to have prosecutors that are willing to press hate crime charges, which usually is more difficult to prove than the underlying crime itself, because basically you're punishing people for criminal acts, but now you're usually adding enhancements to it because they pick people because they're of a certain race or gender or sexual orientation, something like that. And so that means that even if it really was a hate crime, it might never be prosecuted in that way because it's much more difficult to get a conviction. There's different laws that are applicable to it. So that's part of the reason that the numbers are severely understated, as well as, I mean, people don't report. We know that especially minority communities and well, Asian communities as well, when they have new immigrants that have language barriers or that come from countries that don't trust law enforcement, they are much less likely to report. And so that means that there's a lot of going on that we just have no idea about as well. So there's a bunch of things that play into it. I mean, but
yeah. I learned that from, you know, from those big cities. You have to utter any derogatory remarks before you hit somebody that would have more chance of being accused of being a hate crime. If you just go out and see somebody and punch him on the face, they are not going to treat that as a hate crime. They say, well, it's just a random, you know, attack, you know, elderly abuse. You shot the people, you know, that's a Thai guy that got shoved to the ground and he died. He had a concussion back in San Francisco. They are not going to treat that as a hate crime because it's just a, you know, just a crazy person that decide to act up, you know, and on acting, you know, on attacking people. So he had to say something that, you know, make an announcement, so to speak. And yeah.
That we do see, though, it does seem like people are much more willing to report now because it's becoming more known about, I guess, that it's, you know, getting videos of it. And so people are seeing that. It's kind of like you saw the same things with police and, you know, the attacks against Black men, basically, and how that's getting a lot more attention than it ever did because now more people are believing that it exists because they can see videos of it. So now they're probably, I mean, now we're starting to see many more videos of Asians being attacked. And so I think people are starting to realize, hey, this is a real problem. So open society, but also that you're not the only victim. And we've seen a lot of the like the Pan-Asian American groups trying to push people to do this. And they've set up their own reporting lines as well that have way more calls that are coming in than are ever officially showing up in kind of federal documents that'll ever show up in the FBI's uniform crime report stuff. So it seems like it's turning around. I mean, it seems like people are more willing to report and they see that stuff comes out of it too, that helps. Report, nothing happens, then that kills people's willing to do that.
Yeah. And kind of sticking with the whole concept around like reporting, Asian Americans are frequently regarded as the model minority. And as a result, some may feel less inclined to, you know, make a scene, like be vocal with their experience with hate-related crimes or even just incidents in general. Do you think, obviously this isn't everyone, doesn't go about that. But do you think that this technique of keeping a lower profile has helped Asian Americans avoid being targeted? Or does it hurt them by just making it easier for people to harass them without repercussions?
From my experience, I'm a non-citizen. We're just kind of here temporarily because I'm a student, or there's like people with their parents having a job in America temporarily. And like for people like me, we tend to try to keep quiet. We don't want to make any like big, not drama. Like we don't want to make like a big deal out of stuff. We don't want to be like pointed out. And I think that kind of shows they kind of know we're not going to do anything. We're just going to keep quiet. We're just going to keep it to ourselves. And I think that does make it easier for them to point it out because they know we're not going to do anything about it.
And it can be related to people's status as well, too. If you're here undocumented, you're much less likely to report. And then, I mean, just in general, though, people don't report crimes much anyway, even severe crimes. Less than half of them are reported. So it's not unusual, but we see even greater amounts that are not reported when it's a hate crime.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so you mentioned this idea of the model minority, right? And that type of discourse or rhetoric is deeply problematic because in many ways it says, look, the myth of if you just work really hard, you're going to succeed, right? That's the American dream, right? If you work really hard, you're going to succeed, okay? What it doesn't do is address then systematic racism, right? Privilege of whiteness. And in some ways, it also tells other ethnic racial minorities, look, these are right? Asian Americans, they're the good type of minority. Like if only you work just as hard and not stir the boat and not address, right, racism, then you're going to succeed too, right? So I think that in many ways is problematic, right? Because we don't address systematic racism. We don't address how there's these different histories, and that erases also the diversity of experiences of Asian Americans. Sujin mentioned this before. We're not a monolith, right? There are, I think, around 23 million Asian Americans, that Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Korean, right? There's Japanese, Vietnamese, right? We can go on and on, right? Hmong, Burmese, right? Cambodian. Nearly half of those Asian Americans live on the West Coast. About 12% is in the Midwest. And so I don't even remember really interacting with too many other Asian Americans, let alone a Korean American, right? Except for maybe my mom's friends, right? Because all of her Korean friends were married to white Americans, right? It was really interesting. But what my point is that that type of rhetoric, right, I think minimizes, again, microaggressions, minimizes, right? Basically says, you know, put your head down, don't, you know, stir the pot. And if only you know, sort of, you know, work hard, you're going to succeed. And I think that really is problematic. And it also goes in that tradition of like, if you assimilate, especially with immigrant populations, the way to survive is assimilation, right? The way to survive, to succeed, to live is to assimilate. And that's why you don't, right? You're not supposed to, right, disrupt, because in many ways that's going to end up bringing, right, things back to the community, right? That's going to, right, somehow you're going to end up bringing attention to our community, and we don't need that. And so I think that in many ways, in fact, does a disservice by sort of reinforcing that, well, it doesn't happen, that, you know, hate crimes don't happen to Asian Americans, or it's not, right? We don't, aren't discriminated against because we have this label of model minority.
Well, and do you think that that rhetoric and that that sort of like quietness and like, I can't think of the word, like making it smaller than it is, has led to people kind of forget about historical discrimination against Asian Americans? Like, because I mean, when you hear Black Lives Matter is so prominent and you talk about it a lot, and we talk about, you know, these issues, and so we get to slavery, we talk about slavery, we talk about Jim Crow, we talk about all these historical problems. Same with Hispanic people, we talk about different issues. We reiterate that timeline, but with Asian American issues, it doesn't really come back. Like people just kind of forget that we had internment camps. That's horrible. And we don't talk about it again until we see attacks in the news. Do you think that that label of model minority pushes that history to the back of our minds, and so we don't talk about it as much?
I don't even think that I think there's just what I would call historical amnesia. We don't, I mean, I'll tell you right now, I don't remember really getting a history lesson about Asian American history until college. You know, it's not integrated in our schools. It's maybe a little, what I call the little box in the history book that's like, oh, look, this, women in history, you know, Native American, right? Like there's this usually, but I don't remember really, if you don't know your history, right, then you don't understand what's going on now. You know, you don't understand that it's a pattern, that there are cycles, that, right, it continues in different forms. So I think absolutely, in a lot of ways, by constructing this sort of model minority, it says, look, Asians have succeeded in America, right? And so somehow the economic success, even though, by the way, that's flawed. Again, we have a diversity of groups within the Asian American community. Not all are, right, upper middle class, you know, or upper class, right? That in fact there's significant amounts of difference there. But that rhetoric is very problematic because, again, it reinforces that myth of if you work hard enough, you'll succeed.
Yeah, the history's never covered. I don't remember learning anything. I think I remember a box that said, oh, Chinese immigrants built our railroads. Good job. And that was it. And so it was, again, painted in that same way of that model minority, like they are hard workers who helped lay the railroad that helped the Western expansion and that kind of thing, but it never talked about all the things that happened to them. And the model minority myth is also problematic in the fact that it gaslights Asians, because they're like, oh, are you sure that's what happened? Are you really sure that's why they're, saying that to you? Are you really sure that's the reason why? I mean, are you overthinking this? Because it could be something else. I mean, y'all are doing so great. And so, when you have that told to you, you start second guessing it. The same way I was second guessing the log that was thrown right behind me. I was like, what is going on? Is it because I look different? Is it because they were just playing around? I mean, it makes you start to second guess your own experiences, and that makes everything worse, because then you feel like, well, should I report this, or am I going to sound like a crazy person reporting this, when I felt like it really was something related to the fact that I was a different race and ethnicity. And so then you have things being reported less, because people then start to second guess themselves as to what the reality of the situation was.
You both bring up an interesting topic about constructs and stereotypes and how they permeate, and we sometimes allow them to change our perspectives of an entire group of people, right, that we've never interacted with on any substantial level. And the idea that we are made to experience trauma and be silent about it is detrimental to personhood, to peoplehood, to womanhood, to manhood, to children, right, who are just taking a stroll with mom. The idea that you experienced trauma and you did a great job because you didn't complain about it. You didn't march, you didn't protest, you didn't ask for help, you didn't ask for allies or cheerleaders. Wow, that's awesome. That's really an ignorant way of thinking about the struggles that Asian American and Pacific Islanders have faced. And I love the way Anna articulated it. Historically, we don't know anything, much of anything. And if you want to, you have to sort of go out on your own and find that, right? However, what are we talking about currently, right? How often is it on the media? How much are we really taking a moment to reflect on the people that were lost in Atlanta, the people that continue to be targeted in our cities, in our states? How many people are talking about it in the media? And that's why a conversation like this evening, no matter how many views we get live and how many playbacks we get, is so important, so that people understand that these things are happening. And until we stop that sort of trajectory of just being silent about the things that are happening, we won't ever get to a place where we can actually build on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which is, for me, like the B word that people consider to be a curse word. But belonging is important too. Thank you all for sharing. That was great. I have an additional question for Dr. Young. So recently, you were featured in an article, that talked about the sexualization of Asian women. And I just wanted to give you a moment to share with us about that stereotype, those constructs, and how you feel as though they have harmed AAPI women, and whether you feel as though there's anything that we can do to stop those stereotypes and nuances of identity that are so wrong and so detrimental to those women. What can we do in our everyday lives to make sure that we're not sort of allowing and gaslighting those ideas?
Absolutely. Yeah, so a lot of my research is in pop culture and media. And so absolutely, there's a long history associated with representation of stereotypical Asians in media, specifically the hypersexualization of Asian and Asian American women, the fetishization and objectifying and exoticizing specifically Asian women. And that in many ways dehumanizes, right? So Sujin had also talked about the sort of overlapping of misogyny, right? And sexism and misogyny overlaps with racism when we talk about Asian women and Asian American women, right? And by having that combination, in many ways, those attitudes lead in some ways to violence against women, right? If you already don't see them as humans, right, but rather objects of desire, objects to be controlled, right, then in many ways, you're not going to humanize. You can then engage in violent acts, right? And that's across the board with multiple groups, right? And I think a lot of scholars like Nancy Wayne Yoon talks about this, like there's these stereotypes in media that are often portrayed to audiences you end up having what I talk about is yellow fever, right? You end up having this sort of sexualization of women. And if you look also in connection with our history associated with, for example, our military in Vietnam, our military in Korea, right? Having military bases established in countries where you end up having an economy of prostitution, right? Of sex workers. And so you end up having that stereotype, right? And you often had what was called war brides. So you have that stereotype of the submissive Asian wife or prostitute or what have you, also can be extremely problematic, right? Because in many ways, again, that dehumanizes. And so I think that that's really important to consider, right? It's not, a one-to-one correlation, but when we have those particular attitudes and media perpetuating those stereotypes, the majority of audiences, if that's the only contact people have, right? If that's the only representation that they see, then they're going to internalize the stereotypes. That's what they're going to think, I joke that I have so many students that come from small, I call villages of Indiana. And they come to Evansville and they're like, this is the biggest city I've been in. And it's so racially diverse. And I chuckle because I grew up near Chicago, right? And I'm just like, oh my gosh. But for them, they've never interacted with someone who looks different from them or who has religious affinity that's different from them or sexual orientation or gender identity that's different from them. And so like, if their only experience is through pop culture and media, that's what they're going to think, then we have serious issues to attend to, right? I think that's the important thing to consider is that these stereotypes are problematic and in many ways contribute, I think, to, again, increased hate and racist and misogynistic attitudes, especially towards Asian and Asian American women.
Thank you for sharing that. I think sometimes we forget how pervasive these ideas are and how universal they are, right? If a child can watch a cartoon and pick up bias and stereotypes about Asian Americans, why would we assume that middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students haven't picked up those same things, right? After so many years of being fed the same narratives, right? It's then our jobs to make sure we're providing counter narratives, as I like to call them, right? Ways of seeing people, as Dr. Young said, in ways that really go beyond your small town, go beyond what you've experienced growing up, go beyond the teachers you've had, right? The professors you've experienced. And if we are interacting with someone who's, 19, 20, early 30s, early 50s, and they've never experienced an Asian American person outside of their very small personal experiences, it's okay to open their minds up to a counter narrative that displays our Asian American and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters as human, right? As being different, as being unique, as not being in silos with one singular human experience. And I think it's a good point, right? We do interact with young people and we're shocked, but there's so many people who are far older who will never tell you, Dr. Young, yes, you're the first, woman who identifies as Asian American that I've encountered with and had an intelligent conversation with. This is interesting for me. So thank you for being willing to have those conversations with young people. And I want to encourage our listening and viewing audience, it's okay to, as Dr. Young said, have those conversations. And if you need an easy sort of gateway, talk to them about the cartoons they've watched, talk to them about the Asian stereotypes in the movies they've seen, the music they listen to and enjoy. What are some of the stereotypes and the bias that in a lot of ways have changed the ways that they view those people who identify as AAPI, and then work with that and then ask them, how can we work on getting you some counter narratives that help to really disrupt those ideas you have? Thank you for that. Anna?
Yeah, well, and also speaking of like, if this is your only interaction is through the media, this isn't a scripted question or anything, but what does that say currently when what you're seeing on the media is, the China virus or Kung flu or anything like that? Like, that's still really hurtful and it's really prevalent right now. So it's not just the general culture of this is how I see Asian people. It's, this is how I see them right now in relation to current events. And that kind of ties into, I have a question for Dr. Schroer. Like, with modern politics, it's hard to not tie it back to history. And so, Dr. Shore, you study white supremacy. And so just based off of your expertise, do you see any parallels between historical surges in white supremacy and the rise in anti-Asian racism we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think it's symptomatic of times when primarily white males feel that they're losing power in society, and they feel threatened of losing, that they usually view everything as a pie, and if they in some way are losing, other people are going to gain. That's a zero-sum kind of thing, that we all can't benefit from it. And so when you saw that just targeting different groups over time, I mean, you have Reconstruction, and then, well, then you have all the Klan arises, and you crush all the people, and you get, the Jim Crow laws passed, you get the Northern Armies out, all that kind of stuff. And you kind of see it, wave after wave after wave. And we like to scapegoat people in our society, right? For whatever problems it is. So you can see, like someone said earlier, I'm sorry, I don't remember who, but there's kind of this underlying racism that exists in our society, obviously, I would say. The culture and the media tell us who to target, like who are the legitimate targets, and it's very easy to see that. Kind of as a tangent about the stereotypes. I mean, I teach a hate groups and hate crimes class, and so I talk about race in that class, and I'd go over what are the stereotypes of all the different groups. Everybody knows all of these stereotypes about whichever groups we put up there. But back to the point. Yeah, I mean, Asians also, you're seeing a rise in attacks against Asians over the last couple of decades, but also the percent of the population that's Asian has grown dramatically. That it's almost doubled, I think, in the last 20 years, something along those lines. I mean, you start with low numbers, so it's easy to have things double, but so that could be why maybe people are being perceived as a threat. But I would say it's all going back to Trump and the people's calling it this over and over again. And that goes through kind of like the bubble, the whole right-wing bubble that starts to influence all kinds of people. That's like why you see, the politicization of vaccines and everything else too, lockdowns. I mean, this didn't happen in any other countries. And when it started to happen in other countries, it was coming out from the US. I mean, the US people were influencing, the people that are anti-maskers in the other world. I'm rambling, I'm sorry. Yes, definitely. When people see there's issues, when there's problems, it's much more likely to lash out. And because they can't get at that group or that the real culprit in their mind, China or some secret lab or whatever it is, they attack whoever is a proxy for them. And we saw it like, with the Iraq war or whatever, you had people attacking people they perceived of as Iraqis, right, whether they were or not. Same thing after 9/11. A Sikh was killed because people thought he was Muslim. It's like, not at all, but they attacked who they saw. That's kind of how I would see it, but definitely you see cycles, but it's usually when, the groups in power are feeling most threatened is when you start to see much more aggressive use of violence against people. But that being said, it's not necessarily only the dominant groups. I mean, we've seen, high rates of Blacks committing crimes against Asians and other groups as well. And historically, there's a lot of Asian on Asian crime that wouldn't have been considered hate crime because it might have been seen as gang crimes, but it was between different ethnic groups. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't seem to be playing a role now at all, really, as much. But I mean, so that's kind of some of the stuff that I would say. Hope that answered some questions.
That does. Thank you so much. What's interesting about what you just shared is the idea of people feeling as though they're losing power. And that's an interesting choice of words to use there, because in a lot of ways, people argue that they don't feel as though they have any power, right? I don't have any power. I don't have anything that makes me different from anybody else. I don't have any privileges in this world. So why do I feel as though I'm losing power? It's interesting that you would say that in your expertise, it seems as though a lot of the links come from just feeling as though I'm losing something. Something will be lost if I give a little piece of this pie to someone else. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question for Dr. Zhang. So you work with public health. What role would you say that COVID-19 and stay-at-home orders and the pandemic has really played in the rise of all of the hatred and the racism, the violence against the AAPI community? And then based on that answer, if you could also dig a little bit deeper and tell us, what do you think this really stems from, and how much longer do you think we should expect to really hear that this is continuously happening? Do you think there's a timetable on it? Is it connected to stay-at-home orders and COVID-19, or do you think, no, this is something that's going to be around much longer?
So I'm going to be on the record to say that racism is just going to be around, I think, for a while. I can't give a timetable for that. So the second part of that question is, I do not foresee this being something that will go away. It's going to come in ebbs and flows, like a lot of things that happen in history, but it's never going to go away. Now, the reason why it's so prevalent now, and it's much more, in the forefront of a lot of people's minds, is the fact that we do have ways to document via video in terms of surveillance, cell phone footage, whatnots, of these acts. So that's why we feel like we see more of it happening. And but at the same time, we are seeing more of it happening because of the pandemic. And it's, again, as mentioned, it does not help when your commander-in-chief is standing at the podium telling folks that whatever's happening to our country right now, it's because of the China virus, or it's because of Kung flu, which is terrible to even make a joke about, to kind of throw a group of people under the bus for a pandemic makes no sense. But that's, again, and the talk about control as well. I think it's this idea that a lot of folks feel like their quote unquote way of life may be taken away from them. And then they start getting defensive and they start trying to find ways to remedy it because they feel out of control. Being in the middle of a pandemic makes you feel out of control anyway. So having this kind of disaster happening, because this effectively has been a year-long disaster happening around the world and in this country, that bombarded with a lot of other things that are related to a disaster and not having control, it makes people want to blame somebody. And when President Trump, or former President Trump, decided to state a specific group to be the folks that we need to blame something on, well, that was an easy kind of an explanation. Here you go. These are the folks you need to blame because they're the ones that brought it over here. They're the ones that manufacture it. There's that idea that Wuhan, there's a lab there that manufactured the virus and brought it over to just infect everybody and all kinds of stuff. And so in terms of public health, we have already declared that racism is a public health problem. It is related to a lot of absolutely terrible negative outcomes for lots of our minority folks. And so, this is, the pandemic has added on to that, I guess, a different facet of how racism is playing out in the US. And so, and what it looks like to have almost kind of like a pressure cooker situation, I think, with folks being at home, being stressed, losing jobs, not making ends meet. And so that there's a lot of things coming together again that are spurring on a lot of these racist acts. And now we have somewhat of a different target. I think with the whole model minority myth and the fact that folks don't report because they feel like they can't really rock the boat or they can't really say anything about it, there's that aspect that might embolden folks to attack them and think they can get away with it. But I think because of the fact that we, in the Asian community, I think in many ways have seen the activism from the Black Lives Matter movement really helping to fuel, okay, we can do this as well. We need to step up and talk about this because racism is racism. It is not just happening in the Black community, it's also happening in our community and in other communities, and we need to come together about this. And I think that the pandemic and then all the things that are happening, all of the sort of social changes are affecting how we're responding to racism right now in the US. And I know it was kind of a long roundabout discussion going towards public health and racism, but we need to address the fact that racism is real. It is prevalent. It exists. It is embedded into the structure of our society. You cannot deny the fact that, white folks have privilege, that folks who are not white do not possess, no matter what. Does not matter if you have money. There's, you know, sometimes it trumps classism, it trumps income levels, you know, so we need to recognize that and recognize the fact that it has major repercussions. And when you think about health in the perspective of health, if a group of folks are suffering, we're all suffering. It's not just them. They're not the only ones dealing with that. We're all having to deal with the fallout from their suffering. And so if we want to live in a nation and in communities that are healthy, that are thriving, that are functioning well, we need to think about some of these things that are really embedded in our society and come to terms with it. You know, the first step, as they say, is to admit the problem. We have a problem. And we need to address it because it's really hurting people. It's killing people. It's damaging their health. It's cutting their life expectancy shorter. I mean, all those things are coming together. So we need to really talk about that and really face it head on.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And the identification of racism as a public health issue for those people who have vehemently denied it for years. It should help to put into a different perspective. You have a hard time seeing something that you don't have to live with. You don't have to go to bed with it at night. You don't wake up with it in the morning. So it may be difficult for you to have identified it in years past, years long gone. However, COVID-19 and the rise of hate and violence among our AAPI brothers and sisters, if nothing else, should show you that no, this violence didn't just start happening when COVID-19 began and became a global pandemic. We've been dealing with this all the while. We've just found other ways, as you have articulated, to cope. We've not made probably the strides we should have made. We haven't called out the perpetrators in the ways that we should have, but we're tired of that. And we want to make sure people know that it's happening to us too. And the real root cause of it is the public health issue of racism and the fact that this is challenging for us, right? It's changing the way we're able to live our lives. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question for Mr. Tsai. You are the president of the Tri-State Chinese Culture Association. In this city, we have this motto that E is for everyone. How has your organization been working to sort of cultivate a sense of community to make E is for everyone also be E is for you during this difficult time? See, can we hear you?
Here we go.
There we go.
Yes, I just unmute myself here.
Sure.
Yeah. We have this organization, the Chinese Tri-State Chinese Cultural Association, since '81, and that's before I come here, you know, and we run there's a Chinese school going on from '87 and onward, and they stop a few years and then they pick it up again, and I think we still have it. And they go online now, you know, last year. But you know, our we are not like a social club, you know, we are not meeting every day or every week. We are just like maybe every 3 months, maybe, and you know, we had a little activity, a little event. Everybody else had a full-time job, you know, someplace else. So it's like it's a pretty loose, connected club, and most of the time you see the Chinese people. We go to the Chinese restaurant. You know, we have so many nice restaurant, buffet place here, and people in Evansville, they like the food. So we talk to law enforcement that, you know, I say, what, you know, have you, you know, heard anything reported that, you know, like discrimination? She said, no, I don't hear that. You know, people in this town like the food. They like to go eat. They are not gonna, you know, make trouble, you know, with Chinese people. So, and then we went to the restaurant and we asked them, hey, you know, you see anything, you know, that need to be worried about? And he said, no, it's just we, you know, so few of us here in this city, they haven't, you know, run into any crazy person come in there, try to stir up trouble. So that, say that, and that we really didn't do anything. That to say that we had to organize a demonstration now on Green River Road, something like that, we don't see the need to do that, even though we see, the incident all over East Coast and West Coast. So
one of the things I sort of reflect on that you just shared is this idea of loving the food, but not the people.
Yeah, I wish that we would like to see, you need to love us like you love our food.
It's how sad is that we would love the ethnic food, but not love the ethnic people. We love what you bring. We love your culture and all that we can enjoy from that, but not necessarily who you are and what you bring to our city. What I did enjoy about what you shared, though, is this idea that the people you've come into contact with, just in your small group, they don't feel as though they have been disrespected and targeted in a way that really is adjacent to any of the terrible things that we've seen on the news. That gives me hope in our city. However, we have to sort of stand guard and make sure that we do keep our eyes peeled and our ears open, as you said, to the fact that it could happen to one of those people today or tomorrow. And when it does happen, as you shared earlier, for those of you who are just logging on, when it does happen, we have to, one, be willing to admit that we don't know all the details, but two, listen, and three, believe people of color, specifically our AAPI brothers and sisters, when they tell us that they have been targeted. Again, we don't care whether it's been, to a large degree, whether it classifies or quantifies or qualifies as a hate crime, or if it's just something that really shouldn't have happened and something that we know good people wouldn't do. But while those people are sharing with you in that very intimate and private and loving communal space, we're happy here, we're okay here. There are some things that happen, but they don't cause a large protest or a reason for us to be upset. That gives me hope in our city that maybe some of the things we're experiencing will not last long. Thank you for sharing that. Anna.
Yeah, my next question is for Ms. Suzuki. This is different from the original question I was going to ask you, but just listening to this conversation, you're our youngest panelist, and as a young person, I would imagine you know other young people and talk to other young people. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about racism and hatred, we like to tell ourselves that it only exists in the older generation, and that, they're going to sit there and be grumpy because that's how they were raised, and then they're eventually going to die off. That sounds really harsh, but we think they're eventually just going to go away, and then we'll have this new fresh start and racism will cease to exist. Unfortunately, that's probably not the reality of the situation. But just, from like being around the University of Evansville, being just a young person in the community, do you feel this kind of sense of hope that maybe people will get better? Or do you think that since younger people are so impressionable that this new kind of rebirth of anti-Asian hate is going to be a step back and is going to stick with people longer? I just wanted to kind of know what your thoughts were on that.
I would like to stay hopeful. I don't know. I think University of Evansville, we try to be very diverse. We have diversity events with the International Club. And I think they're trying to take a big step on connecting the domestic students with the international students. And it's sad because I went my whole elementary school years in America. And like I said, racial slurs, comments, stereotypical comments. And I still see some of my peers still do that on social media, reposting stuff or commenting or DMing me oh, well, that's not racist because, or, oh, well, Kung Flu is okay because and stuff. But I'm hopeful, especially with the BLM movement, and people are more eager to learn. There's a bunch of informational posts with trustable sites and stuff, and it's easier for them to learn now. And I feel and actually now seeing the videos, seeing what's actually happening in the US right now with Asian hate, that it's more eye-opening. They're noticing that this is a real problem and that this is something we need to learn and we need to keep educating ourselves. So I'm gonna stay hopeful. I have good friends. I have a good community around me. So hopefully this is like that for the whole United States and for my Asian friends too.
Thank you so much for that. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook, continue to drop your questions, please, in the chat. We do have moderators there who will field those questions for our panelists here momentarily. Thank you all for taking the time out this evening to share with us our sort of scripted questions, getting your very particular opinions on all of the things and the nuances that really deal with the hate that we see against our AAPI community. We do have one question from Facebook that's ready to go. And the question states, for our panelists, what advice would you give to the Evansville AAPI community regarding how they should address and or report the violence that they experience? For the Evansville AAPI community, what advice would you give about how they should go about addressing and or reporting the violence or microaggressions that they experience? Who'd like to go first?
I can go first. Okay, from our conversation with law enforcement official, that we were told that we run into somebody that come up to you and try to start any trouble, you try to just de-escalate it, okay? Because this person might be drunk, he might be on drug, he's not in any mood to reason with him. So the first thing, you walk away if you can. That, and then if he if he persists, want to provoke, then you call the police 911, and hopefully that you got more witness near you that can be your witness, and then you get your cell phone ready to record the incident. That's advice from local law enforcement officer.
That is great. De-escalation, and then if that does not work, making sure that you are able to document who is doing what,
Yes.
what's being said, what's being shown to you, so that you can then do accurate reporting. Thank you for that. Anyone else, any suggestions on how they should go about addressing or reporting the violence, whether that be microaggressions in the workplace, at school, in the community, or physical violence?
I would imagine it might be, because you mentioned different places where these incidents happen. So if it's at a workplace, obviously you would go up your chain to report that to HR or your supervisor, whoever is in a position of power to be able to help you. Again, documenting all of this is definitely helpful to make your case. Because again, sometimes we have some issues with trying to make our case by just our words. And so if that's the case in terms of your workplace, that's sort of the avenue you would go. As Mr. Sai said, that if it is somewhere out in public and you are being physically threatened, then obviously you will have to call the police and try to document it on your cell phone as well. It's been shown sometimes that if you do pull out your cell phone to record, people step back a bit because they don't want to be recorded doing something like that. And so that could actually be a deterrent even to whip out your cell phone and say, I'm filming you doing this. And so those are ways to address it out in public. I think with schools as well, if you feel that you are being threatened by classmates or even those who are in faculty, you need to report that you can also talk to your advisors if you're a student about this issue first, because oftentimes that's sort of your closest relationship, sort of a trusting relationship you would have with your advisor. And then they would help to guide you through the process of going up. And there's obviously the Office of Equity and Diversity in different places where you can report these incidences on campus, at least at UE, and I'm assuming same as well for USI. So those are places as well that you can report. I think it's difficult to report something that is not physically violent to the police, perhaps. it might not always be taken seriously. But if it is in a specific place where there are supervisors and other folks up higher where you can report and go up a chain of command, I would absolutely recommend doing so. And I would absolutely recommend being persistent. I think that's important. Sometimes we have this kind of feeling like where if we report something, it doesn't get taken seriously the first time, that we need to step back and step down. But no, you need to be persistent. You need to make sure that it's on record. You need to make sure that somebody is looking into it. And so unfortunately, the victim is usually the one that has to do so and be your own advocate. But at the moment, I don't really see any other avenues in places of your work or school where you would have an external advocate for you. But perhaps your family members would also be helpful in advocating for your case if it was a very traumatic incident.
I would also say, going back to when it happens, right, to you, you sometimes question, did that just happen to me, right? That you start to question your experience. And I think one thing is finding people you can trust to go to and say, so this is what happened to me, right? Finding allies that'll listen and sort of reiterate, like, no, that because, you know, again, my friend, she wasn't sure what was going on. Like, she knew, right? And I told her, I said, write everything down. Like, right, you need to write everything down, because maybe you think maybe it wasn't racism, right? She was trying to dismiss it. And I was like, oh no, you know? So I think sometimes the first step is the recognition that something has happened, especially with microaggressions, right? It's not all in your head, or these are patterns of behavior. And this has not happened just to you, it's probably happened to others. And so I think that's really important, is sharing your experience, documenting it, finding people you can trust to be your allies, and also advocate, I think are really, really important steps.
Yeah, and then as I work for the Human Relations Commission, I'd be remiss if I didn't put a little plug. If anyone experiences, you know, discrimination in employment and housing and other, you know, areas of life, society, you know, we're a resource, and I'll share our information on how to contact us again at the end of this. So I have another Facebook question. Many of you spoke about your ties to education, either as an educator or a student. How can we add AAPI knowledge and diverse perspectives to our educational standards? And how can parents do it? How can parents do it if we know it won't be formally taught?
Well, I'll jump in here. It's going to be very difficult if you're going to try to get something mandated. There's very few things that are taught mandatorily in schools across the U.S. The thing that's, sad about it too, is that the people have no conception of history, not just about Asians, but even about what the people they think of as white are. Like, you know, we're talking about attacking Asians in 1920. Well, in 1908 in Omaha, they drove all of the Greeks out of Greektown and they burnt down their stuff, right? You had attacks against Italians, against Irish, that they were not seen as American, right? But over time they become white, right? And so once you can start to get primarily white people to even hear this and understand these kind of things and how fluid this is and how they are actually part of groups that were facing similar issues, I think if they knew that kind of stuff, that they would step back a little bit more and realize, you know, this happened to me too, and I didn't think it ever did because I'm white, right? Or the people that I'm like. So I think that we seriously need to rethink how we teach history in general in our society. Yeah, so it's even a bigger issue. Right.
That's a great point. We definitely focus on, you know, what we think are like the happier parts of history, you know, like the Native Americans taught the colonists how to get corn, you know, like, and then they all lived happily ever after. And so we like to make our history really pretty and happy and like we love America and we've never done anything wrong ever. And so trying to focus on some of the reality, moving forward.
Well, and that's such a big issue now too. It's like you have states with Republican legislatures that are starting to pass laws that say you can't use like the 16, 19, the
16
critical race, and the critical race theory stuff. And it's like everything that any of us have been talking about is basically critical race theory. If you say that there is racism in society, that it's endemic or systematic, that's pretty much it. And they're trying to keep that from being taught at all. And they want that kind of version of America that everything was great. People aren't even seeing what the Constitution really even said at the beginning, right? 3/5 of a person and stuff like that. All this stuff's glossed over. And it's usually like one great white man to the next dead great white man version of histories that you get. So no one else has made any contributions in our society. And you just wash over anything that's kind of problematic. But the only reason anything's ever added is because people fight for that to be there. I mean, when I was a kid, there was nothing about civil rights when I was in school. Now at least they're getting some issue, some education about this kind of stuff. But still, it's easy to see that our school system is lacking in some ways. And I think history is probably the main thing that's kind of hurting us today, is that people don't understand the past, and they think they do, but it's just this candy-coated version of America.
I also think as an educator, you don't need to just have those history classes, right? That you can, in just about any field, you can integrate, you can address, for example, Sujin talked about in healthcare, right? And health campaigns, and how racism is a health issue, right? That you can integrate, I think of, literature. It's, for me, storytelling matters so much. Who's telling the stories? What stories do we tell? Who are the voices in those stories, right? And very clearly there are certain individuals, certain groups of individuals who have historically been marginalized. Their stories haven't been told. And so one of the things is also looking at how, what stories can we include in our classrooms across curriculum? As a scholar who teaches rhetoric, initially students think, oh, public speaking, that's what you teach. And I go, yes, but we can address, right? We can look at, for example, my classes in rhetoric and diversity. We're going to talk about, Asian American rhetorics. You got to know a little bit of your history to understand why things are the way they are now. And so I think that one of the things is figuring out, how do we go about integrating that across curriculum? And those are little acts of resistance, as educators, even developing examples in the classroom that can incorporate those things are really important. And so I think you're absolutely right, is thinking about education and incorporating sort of, that history that, as I said before, our students oftentimes, it's historical amnesia. And until they get into my classroom, do they realize, oh, I didn't know that. And now maybe I can better understand what's going on now based upon where we were before. So.
And if we're talking about education with younger kids, and that's kind of a lot of times, I have my own students too, but I think about my girls and the education that they're getting, and the fact that they are getting questions about how, you must be related to this other Asian girl because y'all look alike, kind of thing. I think that we can promote diversity. We can promote this concept of Asians are different. These are the kinds of cultures that are related to that, and those kinds of things. As Asian parents in school systems as well, as much as I hate to put that burden on those who are dealing with it every day in so many different ways, until we speak up for ourselves and trying to assert our existence here, it's not going to be recognized. And so I think that's one way parents can try to, and if you are a white parent or you're a parent of another race or ethnicity who do not know much about Asians, reach out to Asian parents. They're not going to say no and not talk to you about, I'm not going to tell you anything about being Korean. sorry, you know kimchi and that is it. You know, that's not how it's gonna, we're gonna talk about it because it is part of who we are, is a fabric of who we are and our cultural heritage. Even though we are Americans, you know, we have those practices within our own culture. So we're gonna talk about it. And one of the ways, because Akane is also an education major, I think one of the things that we can incorporate that into sort of like a trickle down thing, incorporate it into the education of our educators so that they make sure that they cover these things, because I have noticed differences between teachers who are much more aware of these issues incorporating into their curriculum versus those who are not. And so when they're very young, especially in elementary school, they're one of their biggest influences are their educators. And so if the educators lead them to have these discussions, they bring it back home. And they say, hey, mom, hey, dad, I learned about such and such today. I learned about, you know, East Asians versus South Asians and how different they are. And I mean, they're going to ask and they're going to talk and they're going to bring up things. And then the parents are going to have to answer those questions, right? Some of the things that kids are wondering. That makes them go on a journey to find answers for their children, hopefully, and to have that discussion. So we need to have those discussions at home and make people at home think about it when they don't usually have the chance to do so.
I would like to add something. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a teacher who let me, a couple of my other Japanese friends, and our parents to get together, and we did like a little presentation about Japan. Like we did like sports, we gave out food, and I remember when she let me do that, I finally felt proud of being Japanese. I was like, wow, I love my culture, I love my parents, I love my friends. And she did that with multiple people who went on trips, or at a girl who celebrated Hanukkah, and she got to explain it to us. And I think it was important. It wasn't part of the curriculum. She just kind of added that in for us, but it made me feel proud to be who I am. And I think that's something we all need. We just need to kind of be recognized and maybe let us present what we like to do, what our culture is. And that just makes us really happy and makes us feel like a part of a team, even though we are a minority in the classroom.
That's wonderful. I love that. And that perfectly ties in my final question for everyone, just to kind of end on a happier note. Obviously, this is some heavy stuff we've talked about today, but just a reminder that Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month is something to celebrate. And so if everyone could go around and say like something, a part of Asian culture that makes you happy or makes you proud and that you'd like to share with us. Oh, Dr. Young, you're muted.
Now I'm just talking to myself right now. That's a really tough question. You've asked all of these questions. That might be the toughest question.
Especially if you're not Asian.
Oh, so sorry.
Okay, I think that you know, a lot of trait or in the Asian culture is similar. You know, like you know, family oriented. You know, a lot of time you respect your elders, and then you are, you know, putting your children. You have a high expectation to your children to go to college, to you know, education as high as he can go or she can go. You know, those you know, Asian trait, and I think they, you know, it's really make me proud of being Asian.
Thank you.
I guess for me, there are a couple of things. The fun thing is I am absolutely ecstatic that K-pop and K-drama and K-this and K-that is everywhere, because that was absolutely missing when I was growing up, and I felt super alone when I would listen to Korean music and kids are like, what is that? Or what is going on? And now it's like the thing. So I feel sort of vindicated that I liked all this stuff, and it really does have the value to be recognized and liked around the world rather than in just Korea. And so I am absolutely excited that BTS is what it is. And the thing with Asian culture in general that I really like is the fact that we have, we cultivate, or we try to cultivate, a sense of community. And I think you recognize that when you see a lot of Asian immigrants come into the US, that they start to sort of make communities for themselves, because it's an extension of family. And so Mr. Tsai talked about family being very important in Asian culture, and having generations, intergenerations being together, and having that sense of family is a community is an extension of that. So that is one aspect of Asian culture that that I really admire, is that kind of the community, the looking out for others, looking out for your elders, being, conscientious of your children, and trying to live harmoniously, which I guess adds to the model minority thing in a way, but, but maybe that's just how we are. But, I like that, because I think that is how we will survive. That we can't be fighting. We can't be against each other. We can't, consider other folks who are not like us as others, because that's kind of how we're viewed here. Like, we're very much othered in this nation. And so, I hope that people realize that, Asian folks are really invested in community, and that we also like to be part of the greater community. Even if we have our ethnic enclaves, we want to be part of the greater community, and we want our personhood to be recognized as well. So, and to have a harmonious existence.
And I would go along with this idea that I know we had talked about how there's a very small population of Asian Americans in Evansville, but recognizing that we are here. We work in salons and spas, we work in restaurants and service work, small business owners, doctors, educators, right? Students, we are here. And so this month is an opportunity for folks who perhaps aren't part of Asian American communities, right? To maybe take this month to sort of recognize that the contributions that we have made, right? The sense of, again, creating community. I was born, raised, and I've been living in Indiana for most of my life. My mom is an immigrant Korean American, married my dad. He's from Michigan. And one of the things that I didn't until much later on in life realize are, when you have immigrant parents, the sacrifices that they make, right? And also the recognition that, in some ways, recognizing that my life is very different from, right? And all the sacrifices from my parents, and so it's a recognition, again, of community, I think, is really important. And as many of us have said, like, I am proud to be Asian American. I'm a proud, right, biracial Korean American woman. And I think that's important, that we take pride in our identities when, again, historically, we've been marginalized, we've been discriminated, right? We've been othered, we've been, asked that question that many of you have heard, where are you from? And quite frankly, I'm from here. Where are you from? So I think that's a really important part, is taking pride in who we are.
This isn't as big compared to what others said, but since I came here and I'm older now, I have a lot more people who like Japanese anime and Japanese manga. And it's so nice because people come to me with, like, they're really excited, like, oh my gosh, are you Japanese? Can you speak Japanese? Can you watch anime without subtitles? And I don't think that's mean at all. It was a good time for me to make friends. And Castle High School has a Japanese language, like, class, so we'll have a lot more people who are interested in Japanese and interested in my culture. And I think that really got me a lot of connections with my good friends right now, and people who want to go to Japan. So yeah, I'm really thankful for all the cultures that people like around here now.
That's wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing that. Makes me so happy to hear everything you all had to say. Well, this concludes our panel discussion of Together versus Hate, addressing the rise in racism against Asian Americans. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. You all have been absolutely wonderful. It has been just a thrill listening to everything you all have had to say. And thank you to the Human Relations Commission staff for helping put this on as well. If anyone is interested, there will be a Stop Asian Hate rally in Central Park in Henderson, Kentucky on May 24th. I believe it'll be at 6 p.m. So if you do want to, rally the troops and make some noise, that will be going on later this month as well. And again, if you or someone you know believes that they are a victim of discrimination, please contact the Human Relations Commission at 436-4927 or email us at hrc@evansville.in.gov. And have a great rest of your evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.